Howdy, y'all. So, have any of you read? And I can't see you from here. They have the lights set up to help us sympathize with your hangovers, which is really polite of them for your perspective. So, since I can't see you, could you please cheer if you have read the Henry Miller Jr. novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz? Hey, we got one in the back. Okay, so A Canticle for Leibowitz is about a Jewish electrical engineer who founded a Catholic monastery after an atomic war in order to protect books from the Dark Ages. And the novel takes place 500 years, 1,500 years, and 2,500 years after the war takes place. Leibowitz is never actually in it. And it describes this morality of smuggling books and reproducing books and sharing books as like a fundamental piece of the religious faith of the characters in the novel.
So for this talk, we have radio protocols which could conceivably be used in some unlikely nuclear, post-nuclear future. So there you have it. Matryoshkas, nesting dolls, and book-legging bears, if you will. So when you say a radio, I say a parser. I'm not a hardware guy. However, my favorite pastime is seeing how parsers get broken. And radios are parsers too. A radio is this kind of a parser that starts with a physical signal and somehow gets that packet, which some people call a frame, out of it. And just as any parser, it is driven by input that we can generate. We can generate it with expensive radios and sometimes with cheap radios. And if you've been following our work on Zigbee, you should have seen that you can actually generate quite a lot with very cheap radios. And again, those are very simple machines. They don't have all that much extra space, unlike a real parser, which can corrupt memory and then have a state explosion in which you can drive pretty much anything, any Turing machine. But they do have some extra state, and they do have some unusual behavior. So what is that unusual behavior? Mostly it manifests itself as parser differentials. So in noiseless parsers, and this is important, we're going to see that noise makes it a lot more interesting. So in noiseless parsers, beside the normal behavior when you exploit the thing with crafted input, drive it into a corrupted state, and then you drive it all the way to root shell, to full Turing complete power, maybe or maybe not. So this is the common scenario. But there is another, in which you feed two parsers the same signal, the same string, and they produce two different readings of it, two different interpretations of it. Now, many security schemes depend on parsers parsing the same string the same way. And this is actually a strict security requirement. So X509, for example, depends on you, the CA, signing the same common name, the same data that the client, a browser, would then see. Android master key, again, depends on you parsing this packet, this package in which your application is and checking the signature, and then when you install it, interpreting the signed part exactly the same way as the crypto signer did. Otherwise, you have the Android master key when you have two different parsers, two different unzippers, and they simply unzip differently. So in crypto, this is a known failure mode when, yes, you've checked the signature, but what is the signature of, right? And that makes crypto a systems problem, quoting Matt Green. Again, your parsers must agree. Now, that is without noise. With noise, things become a lot more interesting. In Phi, you can have two parsers, that is to say, two radios, interpreting the world completely differently. In one radio's view, I am yelling really loud with a really high signal, while the other radio hears nothing at all. and registers no frames. Why? Because I'm simply using a shorter preamble, or I'm putting some garbage between the preamble and the start of frame delimiter. And one radio hears frames, the other doesn't. Then, of course, the start of frame delimiter itself may be corrupted by noise, in which case you get the packet and packet, which we presented a while ago. And it gets weirder. Travis's 1/8 of a nibble, which you will find in the previous edition of Poco GTFO a few issues back.
Yes, we were actually able to inject a raw layer 1 packet controlling only layer 7 data, and none of the bytes of the layer 1 packet that we injected were visible in the layer 7 data that we transmitted. And the way that we did it was we looked at the physical layer, and we realized that the letters were sort of the same pattern shifted off from each other. So if we transmitted one letter higher and waited for time, for the time between transmission and reception to realign everything, we could create a message that did not contain any of the blacklisted strings. And this let us bypass packet-in-packet defense.
So you can read about this, but the take-home is that noise makes things really a lot more interesting. It's a third player that really makes it fun. And so for this talk, we're going to look at something similar, where we're going to manipulate a commodity transmitter to produce signals that the standard receiver would not hear, or hear differently than another standard receiver. Now, you might confuse it with steganography. We're not exactly pursuing steganography. Our goal is to understand how those digital receivers work, what sort of primitive machines they are, and what their differences are. So this is more about parser differentials in digital radio protocols. But bootlegging is also an option. You know, you think it's a nesting doll, but in fact, there is a message inside. Maybe an exploit, maybe one of those Wassenaar-controlled things. So your circuits are built to extract a particular kind of message. And it may well be, and we are going to show that, that it is indeed possible, that you can construct a signal that two different standard receivers will see completely differently. If you run it through one receiver, you get the bear. If you run it through another receiver, you get the book stack. But it's one and the same signal. So how to make this? You know, how to build those matryoshkas? Well, for that, we'll have to look at the basic physics of radio waves, and we are asking your forgiveness for this review.
So when we talk about these at the physical layer, we do that because there are tricks that you can perform at the physical layer. And if you only play with it at the higher layers, these protocols have pretty much no higher layers. So they lack packets, they lack the modern conveniences that have come from the fiction of the OSI 7-layer model. But those also make them good protocols to study for a couple of different reasons. The first is that these transmit over incredible distances. I can transmit from my apartment in America a signal by radio antenna on the roof using a 20th of the power of a light bulb, and that signal will be audible in Argentina or in Europe. I've not made it to Asia yet, but I hope to sometime soon. Maybe better antenna would fix that.
So it will be a very short book, though.
Yeah.
These are rather small. But there are, you know, this is our world. We can play with modulation. That will work particularly well for the PHY circuits because they are built to detect only one kind of modulation and decode it. And we can build polyglots this way. We can play with error correction, which is just this additional part of the weird machine that rewrites the signal helpfully for you, as it did the 1/8 of a nibble for Zigbee. And we can play with encoding. And it should be noticed for those HEM protocols, encodings are very loose and very forgiving because they are actually meant to be keyed in by people. So here's our world. First, there is the amplitude. You have your signal, and you run it, you multiply that signal by your carrier wave. Now, of course, the world is made of sines. It's just such a thing that if you have a contour, it's easier for you to send a sine wave than just about anything else. Or you can vary the frequency. Again, your signal now is not the amplitude of your sine wave, but instead its frequency.
So looking at this animation, you can see the raw signal at the top. That's the one that you actually want to get to the other radio. Amplitude modulation is that you have a really, really fast signal, and you just change its strength in time with the audio signal that you want to put on top of it. For FM, you have a wave that you're increasing the frequency of it or decreasing the frequency of it in order to contain that same information. And you're doing it so fast that on the receiver's end it spreads out, and these are roughly as wide. But they have drastically different behaviors. For example, in FM, the same amount of power is being put into the channel despite what the strength of the original signal is. So you don't your volume is sort of encoded by how far you drift away from the center instead of by how high up the signal peaks. So it's much easier for you to correctly get the volume right on a strong signal and a weak signal in FM than it is in AM. These also take different amounts of bandwidth. So AM takes less bandwidth than FM does. And we'll be dealing with a protocol called single sideband that takes even less.
So these are the three things that you control. One of them is a phase. With the phase, you can think of having two sources. One is, say, a sine, and the other is a negative sign. Or four sources: sine, cosine, negative sine, negative cosine. And then you decide by using a switch which one you feed to the antenna. So the phase transitions. Now this picture is a lie because you want to avoid those rapid transitions in phase. You want to bring your amplitude down to zero at that transition. But it's not the amplitude that matters, it's the phase. It's which one you're getting. So as a mathematician, you look at this and you see this world of sines. So all you need is all you need is sines, and all you have is sines. And you have the choice of what to do with that sine. You can multiply it by your signal, or you can add the signal to the carrier frequency, or you can add the signal to the phase, which if you add too much will actually make your sine into a cosine. So these are two different modulations for small changes in phase. The result is a bunch of sines anyway, and you see that in your waterfall display. So when your amplitude changes with a particular rate itself, then in the Fourier transform, that just gives you a wave somewhere between your carrier and your carrier plus that rate and your carrier minus that rate. So you see in your waterfall displays this kind of a population of sines that you get out of the Fourier transform. This is the band. You can think of the width of this band as twice the rate with which your signal changes, be it added to the amplitude, to the frequency, or to the phase. Of course, no one does a Fourier transform on receive. This is just a mathematician's fantasy. Instead, you have circuits that actually extract the signal and reconstruct the A, the F, or the alpha for you. And by the way, this is an alpha because theta was not available in goddamn Keynote. So
we'll be cursing a lot more in this lecture, especially when I find myself desperate enough to open that can of Alexander Keith's. If anyone has any real IPA in the audience, I'd appreciate a bottle. So an amateur radio operator thinks about this differently. We use what's called upper sideband modulation, which is sort of like half of AM. You take AM and you cut out all the redundancies. So the end result of upper sideband is that you're just taking something that's at a radio frequency and you're shifting it down until it's at an audio frequency. But all of the distances between things remain the same. So if, let's say the radio frequency were 1 megahertz, and there's a radio sine wave at 1 megahertz plus 1 kilohertz, and 300 hertz above that, there's another sine wave. Well, when I downshift that by an upper sideband radio tuned to 1 megahertz, I wind up with a 1 kilohertz tone and a 1.3 kilohertz tone. They're the same distance from each other. Oh, God bless you, sir. Sergey, could you...
Ask and you shall receive.
Oh, now we need a glass. I mean, I can't drink the entire bottle in one sitting. So so your radio spectrum is just downshifted to audio frequencies. There's a related style called lower sideband, where you do the same thing, but you flip it upside down in the end. And that's usually only used for voice and never for data.
So,
1 second. The radio operator also sees a difference between frequency shift keying and phase shift keying. But the operator sees it visually, not conceptually so much. So frequency shift keying visually looks like two separate sine waves that are separated from each other. So you see two peaks in the waterfall diagram. Phase shift keying looks different. It looks like a single sine wave, so it could be Morse code, except it's just a little bit too wide. And the faster you make the symbol rate, the wider it becomes. So PSK 31 is nice and narrow. PSK 63 is twice as wide as that. And the data rates in these protocols are very low because they're designed to fit within the audio channel. You have to be able to run an audio cable from your shortwave receiver to your laptop to decode it, and another cable from your laptop's speaker jack out to the radio in order to transmit it.
So when I first saw the upper sideband trick, I did not quite understand why and what it was. And then through some interaction between a former mathematician and an active ham, I'm yet to get my ham license. Please do not blame me. Do not try to put more pressure on me to get one. Finally, it turned out that it's a very simple thing. Basically, when you do this Fourier transform, you get for every sine wave that is your carrier plus something, you get another sine wave that's your carrier minus something, which carries exactly the same information so long as the modulation scheme is concerned. It just takes twice the bandwidth. So it's like the subway...
man-spreading, they call it.
Yeah, one of those things. Apparently you can get arrested for that in New York. And so what we do is we just cut the lower half. You know, that's a very drastic way to deal with that. So you reduce the redundancy, but you shorten the bandwidth by half. So you're just left with one kind of sine waves, which are your carrier plus something, not your carrier minus that exact same thing. And that's the upper sideband modulation. So there you go. That's as clear as it was made for me.
The other thing to note is that the central spike gets cut out in upper sideband modulation. The central spike in AM radio occurs at the position that would be 0 hertz in audio. So it doesn't actually contain any information. Instead, it acts as a way to allow the receiver to know where the transmitter is centered, so that if the receiver and the transmitter disagree a little bit, in AM you still get a clean signal. That way, my father and his 57 Studebaker can listen to a modern AM radio station and hear it correctly, even though that Studebaker has no chance in hell of accurately generating a reference clock. In single sideband modulation, you have to generate your own reference clock, and wherever it's wrong, that adds to or subtracts from the frequency of the thing you're listening to. So if you're off by just a few hertz, an adult voice will turn into a child, a man will turn into a woman, or vice versa.
So, but again, this is the wonderful world in which it's all about the receiving circuit. It's all about the parser. And so we can actually hide quite a bit of information and have quite a few polyglots using those properties. So we're going to skip the story largely, which you will find in the POCO GTFO, of why you might want to do that. I hope here we need to convince no one that bootlegging is a good thing. And furthermore, that the dystopia in which we have to do it is, well, kind of upon us.
Show of hands, is anyone here opposed to reading? All right, get out.
But of course, now we have this fantasy situation in which the bootlegging is done by really large antennas.
Yeah, see, you have like a little hut out in the woods somewhere, you run some gigantic wires off of it. They have to be specific lengths to match the frequency that you're transmitting. We're skipping over that here, but if any amateur radio book should explain this to you.
I should stress, though, that the modulation tricks and the receiver tricks are the same for grown-up protocols. Of course, these have much faster data rate, but they have the same modulation schemes, or build on existing modulation schemes that we're going to talk about. PSK, for example, is what you would find in Zigbee. So
the first protocol we're going to discuss is called RTTY. It's also called RIDI. RIDI is a military protocol from the late 30s and early 40s. This was used in practice in World War II. The idea is that you have a ticker tape. The ticker tape on the right is from a military teletypewriter that was brought to the most recent Dutch hacker camp. They actually had two of them wired up so that you can send a signal between each other. And it used Baudot tape, which is the paper tape that you see on the right. You'll notice that there are 5-bit positions, and that there's like a center line that has smaller holes. And the center line is used for timing. In order to transmit a message with this machine, you first type it into a typewriter which punches the holes that you see here. And then you take that tape and you run it into the radio transmitter. And the radio transmitter feeds it through and runs it into an FSK modulator in order to send a radio signal that the other unit could receive. The nifty thing about this is that a ton of military surplus equipment was available in the wake of the Korean War, and this wound up in amateur hands. So, and this encoding is very much like a serial port. You have 5 data bits, you have no parity bits, and you have 2 stop bits. If anyone here is old enough to remember 8E1, this is just 5N2.
I'm old enough. Actually, I said, well, I know, we'll just put the picture of a serial port. And Travis said, it's older than that port.
This definitely predates the DB9 connector. Or what's that pretentious name for the DB9 connector once it finally got standardized? Anyways, this is a picture of the machine from an original catalog. I've not been able to find a vintage picture in color. In modern times, the operator will use software that's compatible with it. So the audio is run out from the sound card, out from the radio to the sound card, and back from the sound card's output to the radio's input. And you sort of go blind when you're transmitting, because when you transmit, you're sending so much power that you're not able to receive on the same frequency at the same time.
But then, of course, you always do. In your Wi-Fi, you have exactly the same situation. And your collision avoidance is, and other MEC protocols are developed specifically for you to dance this dance without stepping on anyone's transmissions, because you can't, unlike Ethernet, hear that somebody intruded on your transmission.
The upper left of this window shows the frequency that the radio is tuned to. You either synchronize this manually or you run a serial port from your computer to your radio. So I have some radios back in America that I can access from here through SSH, and I can have them transmit the examples that I'm showing today.
And apparently, this is all that these people transmit. CQ, 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 which means howdy, as I learned.
Yeah, they're not big for long conversations. I think they're constantly impressed with the functioning of their own radios. So you can see here that the radio is tuned to a little bit higher than 14 megahertz, 14 megahertz and 70 kilohertz. And then you'll notice that there's a smaller number to the right, which is 14071.085. That is the center frequency that has been selected in the graphical program. Because your upper sideband receiver has a radio frequency that it's tuned to, but your actual signal is based on a radio frequency that's a bit higher. So you need both numbers. And down at the bottom, there's a waterfall diagram that shows you what the frequencies of the sound look like. In this case, your x-axis is the frequency, your y-axis is time, and the brightness is the amount of energy on that frequency at that point in time. Here you have a 2FSK signal. So you can see that the signal itself is centered on two different frequencies, which are 45 megahertz apart. 170 hertz apart. So the receiver sort of cuts the band in half. And all it's listening for is whether there's more energy in the higher side or the lower side at that moment in time. And that gives it the serial port signal. And it goes up and down just like you would see if you put a logic analyzer on the UART in an Arduino.
So again, all you have is signs. And moreover, you need to compare those signs as you receive them. This is the shifting part. But that's the as much as there is to this modulation. But you know, you can transmit pictures like that.
Yeah, and people would do clever things. Like they would make RTTY artwork that looks very much like ASCII artwork. This is Seattle Slew, who was an American racing dealy-do winner.
And there is something else to notice. Notice where this is centered now. This is the audio frequency. This is the downshifted signal. Yes. It has been shifted from the actual radio carrier to the range of frequencies that you can hear and your sound card can produce.
So with 1950s technology, you would wind up with a giant spool of paper tape, and running that paper tape into your receiver would produce this text art image. In the 1970s, you would have a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and you would record the audio tones and play those back in order to recreate the message. In 2015, you just copy and paste it, and there's a lot less sport to it. The alphabet used in this protocol is quite different from ASCII that you're used to. One thing that you'll notice is that this protocol does not have a concept of upper and lowercase letters. All of the letters are uppercase. The other thing that you'll notice is that for these 5-bit patterns, they can be either a letter or a symbol. And the way that they implement both is that there are commands that will shift to figures or shift to letters. So if you send the command to shift to figures, then it stops interpreting the future bytes as letters, and it knows that each one of them will be a symbol, like a comma or a question mark or a number. Conversely, if you send the letters command, it jumps back to figures. If you send the letters command, it switches back to letters from figures and begins to send the letter A, the letter B, and so on.
This is what we would call a context-sensitive protocol. In order to know what you are receiving, you should have heard the proper register first.
So if I were terribly thirsty after drinking Alexander Keith's Canadian brand India Pale Ale water, I'm serious, this stuff is guilty of everything that Bud Light is accused of, but Bud Light is at least honest in its advertising.
But thanks to good neighbors, we never went for Scotch.
Yes, thank you kindly again for that whiskey. So if I were drinking Alexander Keith's and I just really needed something that was not watery, and I said to Sergey, "4 vodka, пожалуйста," then we might send this over the radio as something like this. Anyone who reads Russian will note that this is transliterated instead of translated, and there's a reason for that. So when you send the letters command, it switches to letters mode. And if you send this sequence of bytes after it that says 4 vodkas, the receiver will see 4 vodkas.
And notice that sooner or later you need to add Cyrillic, that is to say vodka, to your protocol. And for that, the null character was used.
Yes. So if you send the figs symbol first, then everything after it gets treated as a number or as a symbol. WRU is like a special character. They have an entire character in this language that just means who the hell are you, in order for one station to synchronize with another station. There's also a bell symbol. So just like a Unix terminal, you can make the receiver start beeping if you don't like the guy on the other side. I miss when chat applications had that. You could just start ringing the bell if you got mad. The null character was co-opted for Russian RTTY transceivers in order to add a Cyrillic character set. And in this case, if your receiver could not support Cyrillic, it would render the same message in Latin because it doesn't know that the null does anything else. It doesn't know that it's been overloaded.
So these encodings are loose and forgiving. And again, how loose and how forgiving are they? Well, what if your human typing those letters is actually typing them on a keyboard rather than first punching them to a tape and then running the tape? Well, then you have the idle tone. Letters is the idle tone. You just keep repeating it until there is an actual symbol.
This is called a ditty.
Now, what happens if you run another shift character in the same way? Well, the receiver ignores it. So it doesn't actually know whether a figure is coming or a letter is coming. You can repeat those shift characters in any combination and for any length of time before an actual character comes, and the receiver will be none the wiser.
Because this is a finite state machine, only the very last one counts.
So you can stuff enormous sequences of shifts in this encoding. You can stuff a bear in there. This is a wonderful picture of, this is a woodcut of bears passing through the village in Siberia. This is from Europe in the 18th century, when that sort of ideas still reigned. But we can do better. These bears are now carrying a useful payload. They're booklegging bears coming through the village.
So in practice, you would send a message from Bob to Alice in which Bob never actually starts a conversation with Alice, at least publicly. Instead, what he does is he starts a conversation with Jim Bob. And Bob and Jim Bob, they just talk back and forth about their diabetes and diabetes testing supplies. But every time Bob is kind of slow about hitting a key, and Bob is going to pretend to be a terrible typist for this transmission, every time it's idling, it can start sending one hidden bit per symbol.
Like so. Now, let's take another protocol.
Yeah, so we can't do any polyglots or chimeras until we've done a second protocol. So the second one we're going to introduce you to is called PSK31. This is the 1990s replacement for RTTY. So RTTY was designed in the 30s in order to be used for military equipment. And it was used at a time in which shortwave communication was often intentionally jammed, but it was not accidentally jammed by overuse. You didn't have to worry about too many people in occupied Paris sending messages to England. You had to worry about the one guy not getting shot and found. So PSK31 is designed to be narrower than RTTY. At the same time, RTTY was at a very nice speed in that RTTY transmits characters about as fast as the average typist can keep up. So it's a very good protocol for a live conversation. I can talk to you, and I'm typing about as fast as it can get through. When I'm done, you start typing back to me, and it carries about as fast as you can type. And if you're just trying to rag chew, as it's called, this is a very good protocol for that. The symbol rate is 31 1/4 baud, which with run length encoding and other things is about the same rate as you would type. But it also has a much narrower bandwidth than RTTY. It only takes 60 hertz, whereas RTTY is spread out by 150 hertz. So you're able to fit tons of these PSK31 conversations into a single voice channel. If you tune to 28.120 megahertz, you'll see just the waterfall fill up with these different conversations. And you can click on any of them in the receiver in order to tell what they're saying.
So here is finally something that actually does do a Fourier transform in the receiver.
Well, it does the Fourier transform in the receiver in order to visualize it. That's what the waterfall goes through. And that's also what takes quite a bit of the processing power of the program. If you have a terribly old computer, or if you're trying to run this on a cell phone, it's kind of common to turn off the waterfall after you've found your signal frequency in order to save power and computation.
And of course, again, we want the least amount of band taken by any particular conversation because, well, a whole lot of people can hear each other. Those waves travel quite far, and you don't want to pollute the band beyond necessity.
And you see all that empty black space? You can fit multiple little yellow lines in there in order to have many conversations.
Again, the modulation scheme is pretty simple. This time it's phase, not frequency, as with RTTY. Again, you have a carrier, and then you have either a sine or a cosine. So this is the encoding.
So PSK31 works by inverting the phase of a sine wave, which is a fancy way to say that you switch from the cosine of the absolute position to the sine of the absolute position. And you're also going to multiply this by a couple of scalars in order to stretch out the signal so that it's at the appropriate audio tone. So if you first sit down with like a big cup of coffee and you try to implement this, which you can do in a weekend, you'll find that at first reading, you'll think it should look like this top signal, in which the sine wave just abruptly and in the middle decides to switch upside down and start going the other way. I would play this for you, except that our friendly sound guy would yell at me, and all of you would yell at me because it sounds atrocious. And we'll get to why in a second.
But notice before we go on to that this is a shift key encoding. Again, you change the phase to indicate a 0. You keep the phase as it was to indicate a 1. Now, you can't know which wave is coming for you, sine or cosine. It's just a bright line on your waterfall. You don't know its initial phase. However, you can detect when the phase changes. When the phase changes, it should not change abruptly, because that would hurt your ears, and that would actually do nasty things to the membrane of the speaker.
So at this size, it's a bit hard to see, but the wave here is actually shrinking down to nothing and then growing back. And it's at that moment when it's nothing that we invert the phase. So visually, you don't actually see that the phase inverts. And by audio, you almost can't hear it. Instead, you hear the drop in amplitude. The whole signal sort of fades out just a little bit and then comes right back. And we do this in order to reduce the artifacts. When you abruptly change the phase of a signal, it spreads out over the entire bandwidth and starts interfering with other transmitters.
We're actually going to see the example of that. But now, how to decode that?
So if you'll forgive me for reiterating elementary school math, you recall that a positive times a positive is a positive, and you remember that a negative times a negative is also a positive. So what we're going to do is we're going to delay the signal by just a little bit, and then multiply it by itself. And the way that we're doing this is we're trying to make sure that the delayed signal, if the phase is the same, will always disagree with the sine of the modern signal. So that if it is now a positive, if the phase has not changed, the old one was a negative, or vice versa. And when you do that on a sine wave, you find that you have what looks like a new sine wave. It's just all beneath the 0 line. The only exception is that the phase has changed. And in this case, you're multiplying a positive by a positive or a negative by a negative, and it will jump above the 0 line. And so in the product of these two signals, you just look to see where the peaks are, and wherever it jumps above a certain threshold, you know that that's where your signal is.
And that's how the decoding circuit would actually work. It cares nothing for the amplitude. It cares not that much for the frequency, so long as you don't shift the phase too much.
And just like RTTY, there's a special alphabet for this. It does not use ASCII, because ASCII isn't very efficient for English text. Instead, it tries to do like Morse code does, where the short letters are kept short. And they added the concept of upper and lowercase letters to it. So this you'll find in the REcon edition of Pocket GTFO. If you zoom in on this table, you'll note that the lowercase a is shorter than the uppercase a, the lowercase b is shorter than the uppercase b. And this is because as you're typing a sentence, the first letter of each sentence is more likely to be capitalized. But the majority of what's inside of the sentence is not. When you do announcements, if you're saying CQ, CQ, DE, call sign, well, that's all in uppercase, and because of that, it takes a bit longer to transmit.
Notice something about the encoding scheme here. First of all, every letter begins and ends with 1, right? No letter contains more than 1 0. In fact, 2 or more zeros separate letters. That's the Vericode encoding convention. So what happens if you send more than 2 zeros? Again, your circuit doesn't care. Your decoder latches on the double 0, and it can tolerate as many of those zeros as you like. If your letter is too long, it will be ignored. So that's how you could add Russian and call for more vodkas in that scheme.
This is how the original author of the PSK31 protocol is British. And at some point, he tried to type the pound symbol into his terminal, and it didn't work. And he realized at that point that pound was in the upper half of the ASCII table. So in order to add support for that, he just added all of the upper 128 symbols of ASCII all at once, and it's your local code that matters. This, of course, predates Unicode. And he did this because the original code examples that he provided would ignore any symbol that was too long. It would just assume that it was a mistransmission, and it would throw it out. So by sending ones that were longer than that, he knew that they would not be interpreted as anything else. Well, we can go a bit further than that. We can have thousands of bits in a row, and the common receivers don't actually look up what the letter is until they get that final 00. So you'd have large binaries thrown in the middle of a PSK31 transmission that at the end of the day look like a single misinterpreted letter to the receiver.
So again, you can have a whole herd of bears passing through unbeknownst to the receiving circuit. But then, of course, all of these are encoding tricks. Encoding tricks are boring. Let's do something more interesting and schizophrenic. Let's do phi tricks.
So at this point, I'm going to play for you a PSK31 sound so you can get a feel for how it comes in over the air.
So imagine a setup like this. You have a machine with a sound card, and you feed that through the sound card to the radio. It's this audio range that you can actually hear, and the radio will then upshift it and send it up around the carrier.
So as I play this now, keep in mind that someone who has a good copy of this audio recording, perhaps from the video, can decode the message that's being transmitted after the fact, because it carries through just like modem noise, but at such a lower rate that it's more error tolerant. So you can also kind of hear it waving in amplitude. That's when a zero crossing occurs, and we drop the power of the signal in order to make sure that it finishes cleanly at a zero crossing without spreading out over the band. And in real-world use, I would run an audio cable from my computer to my shortwave radio and tell the radio to transmit whenever it heard noise. There have been cases for Cuban number stations where they've been able to identify which version of Windows they run because they hear the Windows XP startup noise on that frequency every couple of days. This is why I highly recommend that you use a secondary sound card.
So it's not all that hard to make those signals. Here is a bit of a Python-y math that does that.
So the first thing that you need is your audio sample rate. Most of you who do audio work stick to 44.1 kilohertz as a sample rate because that's what's used by an audio CD. Unfortunately, when this protocol was designed in the 90s, audio CDs were still rather rare. And the standard thing to work for was an audio DSP. And audio DSPs worked on samples that were multiples of 8 kilohertz. So in this case, we used 48 kilohertz in order to make everything evenly divide. You also need to choose a volume. In my case, I wanted my signal to be rather weak because I have a friend down the street who also plays with amateur radio on these frequencies, and I didn't want to jam his entire view of the world by transmitting too loudly for him to hear over it. You also need to choose a divisor. In this case, we're taking the audio rate, which is 48,000, and we're dividing that by 1,000 in order to get 48. You also need a length, which is the integer number of samples per symbol. In this case, audio rate divided by 31.25. Which happens to be an even integer number of samples for 48 kilohertz audio rates, but not for 44.1. There are also some variables within your PSK31 generator. In this case, I is going to be our sample index, and that's the index within the sample, so it's like from 0 to length. And at the next symbol, it starts over again at 0. We do this so that the symbols can be loaded into a buffer, and then copied and pasted elsewhere in the audio file without having to recompute them. Also, you'll find that in Python, if you keep adding one symbol to a buffer, things take forever. And then the phase is just a 0 or a 1. A 0 is for the initial phase, a 1 is for the opposite of that. So we can call those sine and cosine, or cosine and sine. From the receiver's position, because it doesn't know where 0 is, these might as well be the same thing.
And you will have these scripts to play with.
So the naive way to generate this is that the sample at a given index is the sine of pi times the phase, that's to give us our phase inversion, plus 2 pi times the index over the divisor, which is like the fraction through the sample that we are. And then we multiply the whole thing by the volume. This sounds terrible for reasons that we'll get back to in a second, but it produces that nice clean inversion of phase because we're inverting the phase on one exact sample. We get the little McDonald's arches there in the middle. The right way to do this is to filter it. And the way that we filter it is that we add an attenuation variable in which the atten of I equals the sine of the index times pi divided by the length. And what this does is it causes the signal strength of the entire symbol to begin at 0, work its way up to full volume, and then drop back down to 0 for the next symbol. This version is slightly simplified in that I'm assuming that we are transitioning on both this symbol and the next symbol. If you wanted to keep everything at full power when you could, you would instead make this only rise or drop on one side. The screenshot that you see at the bottom is that style in which whenever the phase is not changing, the amplitude does not drop. These are the audio spectrums of wave files that were generated by each method. You'll note that the one on the left is a nice, clean, thin green line with a few harmonics where it's unavoidable. And the harmonics are very thin and they're very weak. You'll also note that the second one is a bright green mess. And wherever you see like a horizontal green line, Those are your speakers making a really loud, annoying click. And they make one of those clicks every couple of tens of milliseconds. So as you're listening to it, the original signal is there. You can still parse the message out of it, but it's spewing out all over the spectrum. And in radio, it spews out into adjacent audio channels. So you're not only ticking off the people who are sharing the PSK31 audio segment with you, but also all of the channels above and beneath you.
So there is a reason for that. If you think about how this rapid transition at high amplitude breaks down under the Fourier transform, to represent this gap, this non-continuous shape, you need all kinds of sine waves. You need sine waves with much higher frequency than your band. And of course, when you do your actual Fourier transform or your fast Fourier transform, you get those boundary artifacts at all kinds of those higher and lower frequencies. And of course, the Fourier transform tries to represent the shape of your strange non-sine piece of the wave as carefully as it can. The same happens on the circuits if you're not using a filter, and that's why you're getting that spillover all over the place. So the amplitude trick is actually essential. It's a lie to show the PSK without it.
So a neighbor by the name of Craig Hefner is here, and as I was describing this to him in Boston, he starts laughing, and he tells me that when he built a PSK31 decoder, he never paid attention to the phase, he just looked for that drop in amplitude. And so he taught me a trick, and I love when you drink with people who, like you describe a paper to them, and they like immediately think of how you did what you're talking about, but by a completely different method that happens to also work. So his idea, which also works, is that you can drop the amplitude anyways, even though it's not required during a 1. And so the two waveforms here are, as viewed in Audacity, you'll note that the power envelopes are drastically different. So the above one I can visually read as PSK31 is like a bunch of zeros, and then a 1, and then a 0, and then a bunch of 1s, and then a 0 at the end. The bottom one you cannot read visually. His interpreter will fail to see this because it sees everything as being a 0. But the traditional commercial receivers will interpret the lower message fine. And this trick works beautifully.
So here's another polyglot, quite unintended due to Craig, and we're going to mark those tricks with cats, if you will. So here's another.
So the next one we're going to do is a PSK31 Morse code polyglot. If you listen carefully, it's da-da-da, da-da-da, di-di-di-di-da-da, di-di-di-da. This is my call sign in Morse code, but if you look deeper into it, you'll see that this is a spectrogram on the left. The top one, the first da of da-da-da, da-da-da is the letter K in Morse code, and the upper da actually contains the letter K as PSK31. So by encoding it this way, you can have a message that is valid as both PSK31 and as Morse code in the same duration that the Morse code message would take. The only expense here is that instead of doing like a simple carrier wave, I'm spreading it out a little bit and keeping it as PSK31 for clock recovery. And to do a real-world implementation of this, you have to drop the PSK31 amplitude to be very low, but not actually to 0, because if you drop it to 0, then the receiver loses track and starts spewing noise onto the screen.
So consider, this is a signal that is valid for 2 receiving circuits at once, and it's different things to those different circuits. The PSK receiver doesn't actually care about the amplitude, unless it's Craig's receiver, in which case it does. Whereas a Morse code receiver, the on-off keying receiver, does not care about phase.
Yeah, it only cares about amplitude. You can do a similar thing to create a PSK31 and RTTY polyglot just by having two PSK31 transmissions and rapidly changing which one of them is the stronger of the two. Because the RTTY receiver is trying to receive its bits with noise in the background. So it's perfectly okay with a little bit of energy being on each channel. All it cares about is which one is the more powerful one. And the PSK31 receiver, only caring about phase, allows for rapid changes in amplitude with at most 1-bit error.
So that's one sneaky cat.
And the single bit 1 in a string of zeros happens to be a space. So if you make sure that the error occurs on that bit, it looks like a space to the receiver, which is easy to read around. You can also do work with error correcting codes on these. So PSK31 does not have error correcting codes, but QPSK31 does. At DEF CON this past summer, Drapeau and Dukes presented a version of JT65 in which they were steganographically encoding data within the error correcting bits. So you can do the same thing in QPSK31 or in many of these other protocols. There are some open questions in this, though. Like, if I send a very strong signal in which the bits are very clear and I'm intentionally flipping them, then your receiver should be able to tell that I'm doing that, because you'll visually see that it's a very good signal, and you'll also see that the bit error rate is garbage. But to the best of my knowledge, no one's written a tool, at least for the amateur radio protocols, maybe not for the higher protocols either, that actually looks to see like whether the error correcting bit was intentionally mistransmitted. And such a tool would not be terribly hard to make.
So this is a very important question. Whenever you have a protocol, whenever you have a modulation scheme, the first question should be, what does your noise sound like? What does your normal noise sound like? Does this sound like your normal noise? Because, you know, you sort of have this idea that your noise is uniform and random, but it's not. The fact that makes packet-in-packet possible is that, for example, in Zigbee or 802.11, your noise comes in short bursts, and it kills a symbol or two, not the entire frame somehow. I mean, of course, if you turn on the microwave, then it's a different story. But your naturally occurring noise comes in short bursts. Whenever you have a circuit, then it's built to practical noise. That's how it probably evolved. But what if you start playing with that noise? What then? What can you hide there?
So we're running low on time, but there's one thing that's just so cool we had to include it. So you've all seen this like crazy clip art with the Ethernet cable, and the bits are just flying out of it, and there are ones and zeros everywhere. It turns out that actually works. So we all know that data runs over Ethernet, and we also know that you quite often control a piece of that data. But you don't usually control it very well when you're the attacker. For example, I might control a Tor hidden service that's running HTTP. And I control a server-side script on that service. And the server-side script, whatever data it puts out, goes down to your machine through the Tor network. And I don't know where your machine is. I don't know exactly how to get there. And I don't even really control the latency very good. But I do have like pretty good options as to how fast I supply data to the proxy server. So what I can do is I can send you like a burst of data, and then I can sort of back off for a bit and send nothing. And then I can send some more, and then I can come back. Sometimes you want to exfiltrate data from that. Like, for example, if I suspect that someone in a particular area is accessing my hidden service, I might want to identify that person, right? So it would be really handy if I could turn his home network into a radio transmitter and then drive around with a receiver until I found it. Also, like, we've all done Ethernet wiring, and we've all been a little bit cheap about it. And one of the cheap things that you can do is you can buy a bargain basement brand Ethernet switch. And the other thing that you can do is you can have, when you untwist the pairs to crimp them, you can untwist them a little bit early, and it makes it so much easier to crimp them. So I made the mistake of doing this in my apartment.
Yeah, if you think this is theoretical, it's not.
Yeah. So I made the mistake of doing this in my apartment. Don't switch the slide until I'm ready. I made the mistake of doing this in my apartment, and I'm connected into this apartment remotely by SSH, and I'm looking at the waterfall, and I see a giant chunk of noise right on a frequency that I want to use. And then I move over to another virtual desktop on my Mac, and VNC on a Mac actually stops sending packets when you're not viewing the screen, or it sends like a quiet little idle tone or something. And then I moved back, and from the waterfall I could see that the noise actually went away almost to a very thin carrier wave at exactly the time that I was looking away from the screen. And as soon as I came back, it became noisy again. I then go to the apartment. I'm sitting in front of the computer. I see that it's very narrow. I see that my interference has mostly gone away. I start to pirate a movie. Instantly, there's a bunch of noise everywhere. So what we realized was that the interference was actually coming from the bad wiring, and that you could transmit Morse code this way. We call this the Madeline protocol. I successfully sent Morse code from my apartment down the street remotely just by triggering large file transfers and then short ones.
Well, crimp your cables.
Just by sending a long pulse for a da and a short pulse for a di. You'll see like a couple of points in between where other users of the same network created similar artifacts, but it being less bandwidth, mine stands out.
And their cables were probably better.
Yeah. Oh, they were on Wi-Fi actually, so it was a shorter route to the switch.
So you too can do this.
Yeah. So the other cool thing about these protocols is that they're shortwave, which means that you can go to a local store and buy a shortwave receiver. And I, having a license, can transmit a signal with a ton of power from the Northeast United States. This map shows roughly where the signal gets to on a bad day. On a good day, it gets to Europe and South America and all sorts of other fun places. So at some point in the next month, I'm going to start transmitting sort of fox hunt signals, properly identifying and without cryptography and with obeying all of the other rules. But you can receive these pretty much anywhere in North America or in Europe if you're patient, or in South America, and you can record them, and then you can try and find the hidden message in each signal.
So in the current issue of the Poco GTFO, you will find an article about the DEF CON Wireless Village CTF. But of course, to come to that CTF, you had to come to DEF CON and then go to the Wireless Village and sit there.
Yes. But this
No
CTF
longer.
comes to you.
And so, what are the conclusions? These are very simple protocols, yet they use exactly the same machinery as the more complex protocols. They use the same kinds of modulation, phase shift keying, frequency shift keying, as the grown-up protocols. You can think of them as the levers and the blocks, as the simple mechanisms, as the gears that you start practicing with, and perhaps also sometimes build a huge pyramid with, if you've got enough patience and labor time. So the same parser differentials abound in those protocols. They should be understood. And then with more expensive equipment, you might actually be able to bring them to up the complexity slope to the more complicated protocols. And no longer are you limited to polyglots in just PDF or zip or GIF or JPEG or the other kinds of valid formats that the journal of POC or GTFO comes in. Now you can have digital parsers, digital radio polyglots, which take advantage of both phi and encoding, and sometimes even error correction. So there is ponage in phi. Go find it. Our talk is meant to just show you some very simple examples of where it can be found. But of course, the further you go into that forest, the more interesting it will become.
Cool. Thank you kindly. As Dan Gear says, there's not enough time in the world, so thank you for yours. Goodbye.
Thank you.